His hand connected with my face so hard that I stumbled backward in my wedding dress. The crack echoed through the ballroom like a gunshot. 300 guests gasped in unison as I touched my burning cheek, feeling the sting spread across my skin. "Gold digger!" Charles Bradford screamed at me, his face red with rage and expensive whiskey. Before I could even process what had just happened, his wife Eleanor threw her champagne directly onto my white dress, the liquid spreading across the silk like blood. "Ghetto trash!" she shrieked. "You'll never be part of this family." Every person in that room watched them humiliate me, the poor black girl who had somehow trapped their precious son. But when I pulled out my phone and made one simple call, their faces went from smug satisfaction to absolute horror, because in that moment, they realized I owned the very ground they were standing on. Before I tell you exactly how I revealed I was richer than my racist in-laws could ever dream of being, I need you to understand how we got here. My name is Amora, and this is the true story of my wedding day. The day I went from being seen as nothing to watching an entire empire crumble at my feet. If you've ever been underestimated, ever been judged by how you look, ever been told you don't belong somewhere, this story is for you. Now let me take you back to where it all started. I met Thomas Bradford on a Tuesday night at a charity fundraiser downtown. I was there volunteering, helping to organize the silent auction, wearing a simple black dress I'd bought on sale 3 years earlier. He was there representing his family's company, wearing a suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Our eyes met across the room, and something just clicked. He didn't know that I was the primary donor who had funded the entire event. He didn't know my last name was Montgomery. He just knew me as Amora, the woman with the bright smile who was passionate about helping underprivileged kids get access to education. We dated for 16 months before he proposed, and in all that time, I never told him the truth about who I really was. I lived in a modest one-bedroom apartment in a regular neighborhood. I drove a Honda that was 5 years old. I wore clothes from department stores and worked at a small nonprofit organization. Thomas fell in love with that version of me, the simple girl who volunteered on weekends and liked cooking dinner at home more than going to expensive restaurants. And that's exactly what I wanted, because I'd learned the hard way that money changes how people see you. You see, my grandfather, Harold Montgomery, built a tech empire back in the 90s. When he died 5 years ago, he left me everything: $80 million, properties in 12 major cities, investment portfolios worth $45 million, seats on the boards of 3 major corporations, a collection of rare art worth millions more. But my grandfather taught me something before he passed. He said, "Amora, money doesn't reveal who you are. It reveals who everyone else is." I'd watched friends betray me for money. I'd dated a man who proposed the day after he learned about my inheritance. So I started living under my middle name, keeping my wealth completely private, working at the nonprofit I had founded and funded myself. I wanted someone to love me, not my bank account. And Thomas did. He loved me when he thought I had nothing, and that's how I knew he was real. But then I met his family, and I understood exactly why my grandfather had warned me about people and money. The first dinner at the Bradford estate was a nightmare wrapped in expensive china and fake smiles. Their mansion sat on 5 acres of manicured grounds, the kind of old money property that screamed wealth and status. Charles Bradford, Thomas's father, owned Bradford Development Corporation, one of the biggest real estate companies in the state. Eleanor, his mother, was a socialite who spent her days on charity boards and at country club luncheons. The moment I walked through their door, I saw Eleanor's smile disappear. Her eyes traveled from my natural hair down to my simple dress and back up again, and I could see the judgment crystallizing in real time. "So, Amora," Charles said over the appetizer course, his tone dripping with condescension, "you work at a nonprofit." He said the word like it was something distasteful he'd found on the bottom of his shoe. I smiled politely and nodded. Eleanor leaned in, her pearl necklace catching the chandelier light. How interesting. And where did you say you grew up, dear? The word dear sounded like an insult the way she said it. The South Side, I answered honestly. I watched Charles and Eleanor exchange a look, the kind of look that said everything without words. Thomas's hand found mine under the table, squeezing gently, but I didn't need the reassurance. I'd dealt with people like this before. The questions continued throughout dinner. What did my family do? My parents had passed away, I told them, watching Eleanor's eyes light up at the mention of no inheritance. What kind of car did I drive? Where did I go to college? I'd gone to Harvard, but I just said, back east, and watched them assume it was some small state school. When Eleanor asked if I rented or owned my apartment, I said I owned it, which was true. I owned the entire building, actually, but I didn't mention that part. By the end of the night, I could see exactly who they were. They saw a black woman in simple clothes, living in a modest apartment, and they'd already written my entire story. Poor girl from the wrong side of town, probably after their son's money. Definitely not suitable for the Bradford family name. Thomas defended me all night, but I stayed calm. I smiled. I was polite. And I took mental notes of every single insult disguised as concern. When Thomas proposed to me at a small Italian restaurant, just the two of us and a violinist, I said yes without hesitation. I loved him, truly, deeply loved him. But when he told his parents we were engaged, the real Charles and Eleanor came out. Charles pulled Thomas aside at their house, and I heard every word through the door. Son, she's after your money. It's obvious. You're set to inherit $20 million, and she knows it. Thomas's voice rose in anger. Dad, that's not who she is, Charles scoffed. You're blinded by attraction. Think with your head, not with what's below your belt. Eleanor was more direct with me. She invited me to lunch a week after the engagement, just the two of us, at some restaurant where the silverware probably cost more than my monthly rent. Halfway through the meal, Charles showed up, which told me this had been planned all along. He slid a manila envelope across the white tablecloth. There's $250,000 in here, he said, his voice low and serious. Cash. Leave my son. Disappear. Go find someone from your own background. He said background, like it was a dirty word. I looked at the envelope, then at him, then at Eleanor, who was watching me with this smug little smile. I love your son, I said calmly. I'm not leaving him. Charles's face hardened. Then you'll regret this. I'll make sure of it. You think you can fit into our world? You'll be miserable. And I'll ruin you if you marry him. I stood up from that table, left them sitting there with their envelope and their threats, and I went home and made some phone calls, because if they wanted to play games, I was about to change the rules entirely. The next 6 months were psychological warfare disguised as wedding planning. Eleanor took over everything, cutting my guest list from 100 to 20 people. My friends and family were seated in the back of the venue. She suggested I wear long sleeves to cover up and asked if I'd considered straightening my hair to look more elegant in the photos. She said it all with that same fake smile, like she was doing me a favor. Charles refused to contribute any money to the wedding unless I signed papers that would give me absolutely nothing if Thomas and I ever divorced. Thomas fought with them constantly, but I told him to let it go. I had my own plans forming, because while they were busy trying to humiliate me and push me out, I was gathering information. I hired people to watch them. I pulled records. I used my connections, the ones they didn't know I had, to dig into every aspect of Charles Bradford's business empire. And what I found was fascinating. Bradford Development Corporation was drowning in debt. $12 million in the red, most of it from failed projects and Charles's gambling habit that Eleanor pretended didn't exist. They were leveraged to their eyeballs, barely keeping up appearances, which explained why they were so desperate to protect Thomas's inheritance. They needed his money to bail themselves out. But here's the thing, they never bothered to find out about me. I already owned 6 of the 12 buildings that Bradford Development rented for their operations. Through my holding companies, using my legal name Montgomery. I'd been their landlord for 2 years. I was also on the board of directors at First National Bank, where every single Bradford account was held. I'd seen their financials. I knew exactly how desperate they were. And 2 weeks before my wedding, I did something that would change everything. I bought their mortgage, that mansion they were so proud of, the one they'd used to intimidate me at that first dinner. I own the note now. Every month, their payment came to one of my companies. The wedding day arrived, with perfect weather, blue skies, and sunshine streaming through the garden venue. 300 guests filled the white chairs, most of them from the Bradford side of the family. I walked down that aisle in my dress, simple and elegant, and I saw Charles and Eleanor sitting stone-faced in the front row. Eleanor had actually worn white to my wedding, trying to upstage me. Charles refused to smile in any of the photos, but I didn't care. I married Thomas, the man I loved, the man who loved me for who I was, not what I had. We said our vows, we kissed, and we moved to the reception as husband and wife. The reception started smoothly enough. Thomas and I had our first dance, while his family watched with barely concealed disgust. I could hear the whispers from the Bradford tables. She's pretty, but is she educated? I heard she lives in a tiny apartment. Thomas could have done so much better. Every word reached my ears, and I smiled through all of it. I'd planned for this. I'd prepared for this. And when Charles stood up, drunk and angry, to give his father of the groom speech, I knew the moment had finally arrived. Charles grabbed the microphone from the DJ, his words already slurring. "My son Thomas," he began, his voice booming across the ballroom, "has always been impulsive. Sometimes he makes choices that surprise us, like marrying someone from such a different background." The room got quiet. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Thomas stood up, his face flushed with anger. "Dad, that's enough." But Charles ignored him, emboldened by the alcohol and his own hatred. "We worry about compatibility, about intentions. I just hope she signed that prenup." Some of the Bradford family members actually laughed. That's when I stood up. I walked toward Charles, calmly, my heels clicking on the marble floor. "Excuse me," I said politely. "I'd like to say something." I reached for the microphone, but he yanked it away from me. "Sit down, gold digger," he snarled. The entire room gasped. I stayed calm, my voice steady. "Charles, please, I just want to—" He cut me off with words I won't repeat, a racial slur that made every person in that room freeze. And then, before I could even react, his hand came up and cracked across my face, so hard that I stumbled backward. The sound echoed through the silent ballroom. My cheek exploded with pain and heat. Thomas caught me before I fell, but I barely registered his hands on my arms because I was watching Eleanor. She stood up from her table, grabbed her champagne glass, and walked straight toward me. For a second, I thought she might apologize for her husband. Instead, she threw the entire glass of champagne directly onto my white wedding dress. The cold liquid soaked through the silk, spreading across my chest and stomach. "Ghetto trash!" she screamed at me, her face twisted with rage. "You'll never be part of this family. You trapped him. You're nothing but a—" She used the same slur her husband had, and then she added a few more for good measure. 300 people watched in absolute horror as my new in-laws assaulted and humiliated me on my wedding day. I touched my burning cheek. I looked down at my ruined dress, and then I smiled, because they'd just given me exactly what I needed. I walked calmly to the DJ booth, my heels clicking in the dead silence of that ballroom. "May I borrow your microphone?" I asked politely. He handed it to me with shaking hands, his eyes wide. I turned to face those 300 guests, many of whom had their phones out, recording everything. Good. I wanted this recorded. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice clear and strong, despite my stinging cheek, "I have a confession to make." Charles was smirking at his table, thinking he'd won. Eleanor stood with her arms crossed, satisfied. "Charles and Eleanor think I'm a poor girl who trapped their son. They offered me money to leave him. They investigated my background. They've spent 6 months trying to humiliate me and push me out of this family. And tonight, as you all witnessed, Charles slapped me and Eleanor assaulted me, both of them using racial slurs, because they think I'm beneath them. I paused, letting that sink in. So I think it's time you all knew the truth. I pulled out my phone and connected it to the venue's projection system. My full legal name, I said, watching some faces in the crowd start to register recognition, is Amora Elise Montgomery. The gasps started immediately. Montgomery. That name meant something in this city. My grandfather was Harold Montgomery. More gasps. Harold Montgomery, the tech billionaire, had been a legend. He passed away 5 years ago and left me his entire fortune. I pulled up my bank statements on the screen. $80 million. The number glowed on the wall behind me. Then I showed the property deeds. 12 commercial properties across major cities. Then the stock portfolios. 45 million in investments. Then my board member positions at 3 major corporations. Charles's smirk had disappeared. He was staring at the screen like he was seeing a ghost. "Charles," I said, turning to look directly at him. "You know that office building downtown? The one Bradford Development rents for your headquarters?" His face went pale. "I own it. Through Montgomery Holdings, LLC. In fact, I own 6 of the 12 buildings your company rents." I showed the property documents, clear as day. Charles sat down heavily in his chair, and I watched the reality crash over him like a wave. "Eleanor," I continued, turning to my mother-in-law, "you know First National Bank? Where your family has all their accounts." Her eyes went wide. "I'm on the board of directors. Have been for 3 years." I showed my board identification. "I've seen every account, every transaction, every loan, including the $5 million loan Charles took out last month that he's struggling to pay back." The room was completely silent, except for the sound of phones recording. I kept going because I wasn't done. Not even close. "This wedding venue, I own it. That $50,000 you paid for tonight went to my company. The catering company, mine. The flowers, my business. The band, I'm their primary investor. I gave Thomas a 90% discount as my wedding gift to us." Thomas was staring at me with his mouth open, realizing for the first time exactly who he'd married. "That nonprofit Eleanor mocked? I founded it. I fund it completely. $2 million annually. We've helped 5,000 families in this city, which is more than your family's charity has done in 20 years. Charles tried to stand up, tried to say something, but I wasn't finished. "Charles, remember that bribe? $250,000. I pulled out another document. "That's less than I make in interest in 1 month. But here's the interesting part." I showed the mortgage transfer papers on the screen. "I bought your mortgage last week. This mansion you're so proud of. I own the note. Your monthly payment comes to me now." Charles's hands were shaking. He looked like he might be sick. "And about Bradford Development Corporation," I continued, my voice never wavering. "You're $12 million in debt, aren't you? I know because I own 30% of your company. Bought the shares through an investment firm 2 years ago. Silent partner, you never knew." His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. "And as of this morning, I'm calling in my shares. You have 30 days to buy me out. That's $15 million you don't have." I turned to Eleanor, who had started crying, though whether from rage or humiliation I couldn't tell. "Those charity boards you're so proud of? The museum? The Children's Hospital? The Arts Foundation? I'm the primary donor to all 3. I give $5 million annually. Your family gives $50,000. I could have you removed from those boards with 1 phone call." Then I addressed some of the guests directly, people I recognized from my work in the city. "Mr. Peterson, I approved your business loan last month. Mrs. Chen, I own the gallery showing your art. Senator Williams, my foundation donated to your campaign. Judge Anderson, we served on that committee together last year." Half the room had known exactly who I was the whole time. The other half was just now realizing they'd been watching a billionaire get slapped and called racial slurs by people who were barely holding on to their own wealth. Thomas finally found his voice. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. And I could hear the hurt mixed with the shock. I turned to him, and for the first time that night, I let the tears come. "Because I needed to know you loved me," I said. "Not my money, not my name, not my status, just me. You loved me when you thought I had nothing, and that's how I knew you were real." I looked back at Charles and Eleanor. "Your parents proved exactly why I hide my wealth. They judged me, they insulted me, they tried to bribe me, they investigated me, and tonight they slapped me and assaulted me, all because they thought I was beneath them." I took a breath, but I was never beneath them. I was always above them. They were just too blinded by their own prejudice to see it. I made phone calls right there in that ballroom, in front of everyone. I called my lawyer. Execute the mortgage clause on the Bradford property. I called my business manager. Pull out of Bradford Development completely. Liquidate all shares by end of business Monday. I called my assistant at the bank. Have Eleanor Bradford removed from all charity board positions where I'm a donor. Charles tried to apologize, suddenly sober and terrified. "Wait, Amora, please, we can talk about this." I cut him off. "You slapped your son's wife at her wedding. You used racial slurs. You assaulted me. Your wife threw champagne on me and called me trash. There is nothing to talk about." I nodded to the security team I'd hired. "Please escort Mr. and Mrs. Bradford out of this venue. They're no longer welcome at my property." They escorted Charles and Eleanor out of their own son's wedding reception, while 300 guests watched and recorded every second. The videos were on social media within the hour. By midnight, the story had gone viral. "Racist wealthy couple attacks Black bride. Doesn't realize she's a billionaire who owns their mortgage." The headlines wrote themselves. And in the morning, the real consequences began. Bradford Development stock dropped 40% when investors learned about the debt and my share liquidation. Charles couldn't meet his mortgage payment, and the bank where I sat on the board started foreclosure proceedings. Eleanor's charity boards removed her immediately. Their country club revoked their membership. Every single one of their wealthy friends cut them off, not because they cared about racism, but because associating with social pariahs was bad for business. Within a month, Charles had lost the mansion, lost his company, lost everything. Eleanor divorced him and got nothing because there was nothing left to get. They moved into a small apartment across town, and Charles got a job working for someone else for the first time in his entitled life. All because they'd judged a woman by the color of her skin and the clothes she wore. All because they'd assumed that quiet meant powerless. Thomas and I are still together, stronger than ever. He told me that he fell in love with a woman at a charity event who had a kind heart and a beautiful smile. And that's still who I am, money or not. We renewed our vows in a small, private ceremony with just the people who actually loved us. And I went back to my work at the nonprofit, helping kids get access to education, because that's what matters to me. The money is just a tool. It's what you do with it that defines who you are. I think about that slap sometimes. I think about the champagne soaking into my dress. I think about the racial slurs and the hatred in their eyes. And I think about how Charles and Eleanor looked when they realized that the woman they'd tried to destroy could buy and sell them 100 times over. They saw a black woman in a simple dress and assumed I was poor. They assumed I wanted their money. They never asked about my education, my work, my life. They just judged me on sight, and that judgment cost them everything. My grandfather was right. Money doesn't reveal who you are. It reveals who everyone else is. And that slap? That slap revealed exactly who Charles and Eleanor Bradford were. It also revealed who I was. Someone who doesn't need to flaunt wealth to have power. Someone who can smile through hatred because I know my own worth. Someone who understands that the best revenge isn't violence or anger. It's simply revealing the truth and letting the consequences unfold naturally. So to anyone out there who's ever been underestimated, who's ever been judged by how they look, who's ever been told they don't belong, remember this story. Remember that the quiet person in the room might own everything you see. Remember that assumptions can cost you everything. And remember that you should never, ever underestimate a woman in a simple dress, because she might just be the one person you should never have slapped.